A bit more about efficiencies. I am going here towards the grid constraints in Germany, challenges in optimizing congestion, and bringing us back, of course, about the increase over all these years of the renewable production. In the beginning, you also said the politics rather stable in Germany. We have these 4 different TSOs, they're coupled in price, but there's always the conversation on should there be different price zones within the German market. What do you think about that?
Well, I have a strong opinion that in that case, but before I start with that, maybe explain a bit. We have more or less 3 different approaches. One approach is we have one national price zone. Often it's called a copper plate, which I don't really like as a name, but you ignore grid congestions within a country. The second approach is the so-called zonal pricing, where you more or less split up a bigger area into a limited number of zones. Within that zone, we still ignore congestions, grid congestions, but within a given nation or even within a given TSO, you need to transfer electricity from one zone to another, and you have different prices there. The Nordics are a very nice example for that. Italy is a nice example where it works quite well, let's say. But the question is, why do we do that? And the next approach, which usually is not done in Germany, mostly in the US, is nodal pricing. That then comes down to every grid connection point, in theory, could be its own pricing area. Practicality shows, especially in the US, that you have preferred trading zones, trading nodes, where you most do your trades on, and then you trade contract for differences, mostly on a financial basis or future basis, to hedge yourself on the node where you are physically located. Germany, as federalism is quite strong, despite of this 900 municipality, we don't want to have any discrimination on wholesale electricity prices, depending on where you're located. So that's why Germany always said, we are one price zone. We are this one copper plate. And when it comes to that, even what we should remember and not forget is that the German price zone was including the Austrian price zone. So it was the German-Austrian price zone. This is one step. The other thing is that parallel on that, we did increase the fluctuating renewable. Mostly we started with wind, and then we started with solar energy. And we did build up a lot of wind farms in the north and a lot of solar farms in the south of Germany. The problem is that most of the demand areas is not in the north. The power demand is in the middle of Germany and a little bit on the south. So somehow electricity needed to flow from north to south, and for that we needed to have the grid architecture. I spoke about how slow decisions sometimes are when it comes to fuel mix, that it takes 20, 30 years to make a decision. When it comes to grid pattern and how to construct grids, that even takes much longer, and they are lasting for even longer. So the grid development was slower than the installed capacities of fluctuating renewables. So instead of electricity, and as electricity only flows the way of the lowest resistance, flowing through Germany to the south, in case we had a lot of wind in the north, or the other way around, it flow around Germany. So to Poland, from Poland to the Czech Republic, and then to Bavaria. And those loop flows have not been very well received by our neighbors, where they said, no, that doesn't work. We need to split up the German zone from the Austrian zone. But still we have loop flows. And still we have the issue in Germany that our grid development is slower than the development of fluctuating renewables. So our neighboring countries are not very happy about that until we are building up a so-called power line highway, a line from the North Germany to the South Germany. Having said that, one solution, at least on a political level, was, hey, let's split up the price zone, Germany into price zones, especially because we are also having issues in ramping up conventional power plants. If I'm explaining this to my aunt, for example, she's 80 years old, why is that happening? I always say that we have like a wind belt in the north of Germany, we have a conventional power belt in the middle of Germany, and we have a solar belt in the south of Germany. And as the conventional power plants are feeding in the middle of the grid, they need to ramp down to let electricity flow from north to the south or from south to the north. And as the grid topography is not really very well, we have a lot of ramping up and down, the so-called redispatch, and that costs a lot of money. And one argument is in zonal pricing that we can avoid redispatch costs. For my personal opinion, physical flow will be the same. After splitting up into price zones, and the discussions are between one price zone and 5 price zones in Germany, So redispatch costs will still be there, but they are hidden then in the prices and not seen as an extra cost. First, my argument against also zonal pricing, and I know that Montel being a Nordic company, I have a lot of internal discussion also with my colleagues in the Nordics, that especially in Norway, the argument, and they have zonal pricing since 30, 35 years, that with different price zones, there's an incentive to build cross-border capacities to reduce the potential price gaps. But nothing has been built in Norway. So in Germany, a price zone will not lead to additional grid investments for zonal cross-border capacities or cross-zonal capacities. And another example is, then with lower prices in the north, you have an incentive for the German industry to move to the north. Well, I always say that might be right, but it's not always the power. It's also about the people. And I can't imagine that BMW, the Bavarian motor factory, will move to the north and then be called Hamburg Motor Factory.
It has something to do as well with culture and where you're from, right? You cannot just take the identity of a company nor a factory and physically move it.
And it's a labor cost. It's also not only connection to the power grid, connection to the gas grid. It's the connection to the highway, your additional manufacturers which are close by to your factory, and so on. So it's more complicated than just the power.
And we have seen last year, I think, record levels of curtailment. You mentioned the high amount of the redispatch, very, very costly. Would you say that that is a result of lack of north-south interconnection, or is the lack of flexibility, or what is the main issue here that's driving these peak redispatch?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, honestly. First of all, if in case we would have much more grid connections, we could use the existing overproduction, just call it this way, to avoid curtailments in a lot of areas within Germany. And that could help a lot. Nevertheless, with the plans of the German government to have a significant amount, 80% by the year 2030 of fluctuating renewables, by the way, I don't think that we are getting there, but that's another discussion. It's a challenge. So the grid connection won't be there. So we need much more flexibility in the market. And flexibility can be a lot of things. Of course, these days we are talking a lot about batteries, but it could also be load shifting. It could be other electricity storage facility or any type of flexibility which could help us. But still, I would say, even with the given flexibility, if we utilize that more and the additional batteries, the growth path for fluctuating renewables, especially in Germany, is higher than the growth path of BESS. And so therefore, we still have a bit the issue. We still have the fact of redispatch, and we will not get rid of that because the grid system has been built on a thermal power plant approach 50 years ago and cannot adapt as quickly as the development of the power plants.
So on what time scale will we still be seeing then these high amounts of redispatch due to increasing higher renewable penetration? Are you thinking 5 years, 20 years? What is your feeling?
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, taking the example of the belt, so I never really thought about it, but if you take the example of the power plant belt in the middle of Germany, with a coal phase out, especially lignite phase out, 2030, we will not have this centralized, in Germany, central production of conventional power plants. As I expect, especially with gas turbines, that there will be a bit more scattered around Germany, that the redispatch amount will be reduced anyhow, especially if we take batteries into account. I think batteries will help us a lot, but there will always be a redispatch somehow.
Of course, the grid will need to remain balanced, of course, and there will always be a spread of production and consumption to some effect.